You say when, Isabel?
Go on ahead. I think we're good to go.
All righty. Hello, everyone. I'm State Representative Barbara McLachlan from House District 59. In 1992, state voters amended Article 10 of Colorado's Constitution, restricting revenues for all levels of government, including state and local schools. TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, changed our state's financial landscape. Colorado's long bill, which is our budget, is in the state Senate this week, being discussed and dissected. It will be in the House next week, where we will do the same. I thought this would be a good time for all of us to understand how we look at every inch of the budget every year and what influences our decisions. So our guests tonight are here to explain how TABOR works and how it affects you. I'd like to welcome both of you. So if you would like to introduce yourself, and we'll get going on tonight's presentation. Thank you. Representative Bird, would you like to start?
Sure. I'm Shannon Bird. I represent the City of Westminster, and I am currently the Vice Chair of the Joint Budget Committee and also the Vice Chair of the House Appropriations Committee. I've been in the legislature since 2019 and have always served in a finance capacity. Representative McLachlan, would you like me to dive into a little bit more information about TABOR, or are we just doing introductions?
You can dive in if you want to. Why don't we both do introductions and then you can dive? How's that?
Hi, I'm Joshua Mantell. I'm the Fiscal Advocacy and Special Projects Manager with the Bell Policy Center. The Bell Policy Center is a nonprofit focused on economic mobility here for statewide issues in Colorado. And I am honored to be here and excited to chat with all of you, but I will go let Rep. Bird take it away.
That this is one of the more fascinating aspects of Colorado law. It makes us very unique and makes our work as citizens in a democracy, I think, that much more important. And it has made my work on our Joint Budget Committee really interesting. So wherever people land on the TABOR amendment, I think it has something for everyone. And what I'd like to do is kind of talk about first the key features of the TABOR amendment, and then also give you kind of a high-level overview of the amendment's impact on our state. And I have been involved at all levels of dealing with TABOR, whether it is working with local governments trying to pass bonds and mill levy overrides to fund our schools, or now all the way working on our Joint Budget Committee, trying to find out how we thoughtfully invest in the priorities that voters expect their state to support. So just kind of beginning with the key features of the TABOR amendment. And I think this is really important. I'm thrilled to see so many people on this call, because as voters, we need to understand the TABOR amendment because it informs our responsibilities as voters. So the first feature, and I think this is one that most people talk about all the time, is that the TABOR amendment prohibits any tax increase unless there has been a voter approval. So I think most of us are aware of that. Although new people coming to our state are frequently surprised by that, many times a new person moving to Colorado who has never seen the TABOR amendment often wonders why we have so many tax questions on the ballot. In fact, I've come across this many times as I've been out knocking on doors, campaigning for myself. People ask, why are all of these questions here? Why don't our state lawmakers make these decisions? And that is because of the amendment to our Constitution, which is unique amongst our 50 states. Another key feature of the TABOR amendment is that it limits the growth of state and local tax revenues. So every year, the amount of revenue that the state, and revenue, what I mean by that is tax dollars. So the amount of tax dollars that, and I'm just going to talk about the state, local governments are also bound by the TABOR amendment in a variety of ways. But our state government, we may only retain tax dollars equal to the same amount we retained last year, and we are allowed to grow that amount incrementally by the amount of population growth plus the rate of inflation measured by the Consumer Price Index. And why that's important is because the consumer price index isn't always a great measure of inflation for the costs that your state government has to pay for. So you think about health insurance. If only health insurance and the cost of healthcare were to grow only by the rate of inflation, sadly, we know that it doesn't, right? So it's an interesting cap on how much revenue tax dollars your state can collect and retain. So that's something just to keep in mind. Another feature is that the Tabor Amendment limits the kinds of taxes that can even be imposed upon voters. So voters, again, you have to say yes or no to this, but that amendment to the Constitution prohibits real estate transfer taxes, also prohibits estate property tax, and also requires that we have a flat state income tax. So many other states, and including our federal tax code, we see a progressive tax rate. So for people who are higher income earners, you typically have a higher rate of income tax. In Colorado, we don't do that. Everybody pays the same flat tax. The other piece is Tabor also defines requirements and restrictions concerning tax elections. So I think the thing that's most important for you to know is that anytime you have a measure on your ballot that is asking for money, the beginning language says, and it must say this in all caps, shall taxes be increased. And what's interesting about this, I first learned about this requirement when I was working with my school district and actually parent advocates trying to pass a bond to pay for new schools. So we were a volunteer citizen campaign. And what was interesting in this case is that our school district actually had enough money to pay to fund like a monthly mortgage payment, if you will. So we call it bonds. A local government will issue bonds, which is borrowing money to pay for big capital improvements. And in this case, it was to build new schools. The school district had the money to pay for those bonds, but still needed to go and seek voter approval to borrow the money. So even though we could pay, we had enough money to pay these off, we still had to get voter approval. And even though we didn't have to raise anybody's taxes, that question still had to start off with that language, shall taxes be increased? So you just have to be very thoughtful when you read your questions on your ballot and understand, is this actually going to cost me more money? Or what is it that people are actually asking me to do? The other key feature here, and this should be thought-provoking piece of information for anybody who cares about budgets and being thoughtful, is that the Tabor Amendment limits the ability of government to save money in reserve. And the reason for this is that Tabor's revenue growth limit applies to money coming into state government, regardless of whether the funds are spent or whether they are held back in a rainy day reserve fund. So that becomes a challenge for state governments in many respects. So quickly transitioning over to how the Tabor Amendment has had an impact on our state. I think most of us know, if we've lived in any other state, we know that the Tabor Amendment has been successful in keeping Colorado state taxes very low relative to many other states. I think we just, in fact, last year reduced our state income tax rate even further to 4.4%. So we enjoy a very low rate of taxation here in Colorado. The other impact of Tabor is that it has had the effect of shrinking our state's operating budget as a percent of our total economy. The challenge there, however, is that that means that government, and I say government largely, but it has prevented government in many respects from being able to keep up with the growth of costs that you expect us to fund. So, I know I hear in Westminster, where I represent, people care very much about investments in higher education. They care very much about investing in public schools and paying our teachers a good wage. Basic state benefits. If you have a child who is disabled and you rely upon state assistance for either medical care or living assistance for your family members, it has limited the state's ability to go in and provide those sorts of resources. So those are challenges. for our state. And that's just keeping it at a high level. I don't want to take up too much more time, but I hope that gives you a nice thumbnail sketch. And I'm happy to do a deeper dive into how I've seen this play out on the JBC, but I want to make sure I give time for Mr. Mantell as well.
Thank you, Rep. Bird. For those of you who need to ask some questions, there's a Q&A button down at the bottom. So as they're speaking, if you have a question that pops into your head, please ask it, don't answer it. And we will get to you. We will get to as many questions as we can tonight. Okay, thank you. Welcome, Mr. Mantell.
Thank you so much. I actually have a couple of slides, if that's all right, that I would, because I work at the Bell Policy Center, a research and advocacy organization. We love our graphics and charts and all of that. So I figured I would bring that here. So I think Representative Bird did a great job of kind of giving the overview of what TABOR is and how it affects, and especially given her role on the Joint Budget Committee, I think it's really helpful to kind of think about that in terms of how we structure a lot of our spending and revenue. I want to give from an outsider's perspective, kind of where we see TABOR and really how it's impacted how we've been able to really think about the role that Colorado can play in public investment and the role that that we can do in making state and economic opportunity available for all Coloradans across the state. So as Rep. Bird mentioned, we have TABOR mandates a lot of different things about our tax structure. And one of the things that TABOR says is that it prohibits any kind of graduated income tax. So that would be, for example, when you're filling out, I know it's tax season for a lot of people, when you're filling out your federal income taxes, we have a federal graduated income tax. So that depending on how much money you make, the percentage of your dollars going to the federal government will increase with the amount of income that you are doing. In Colorado, all income is taxed at the exact same level. So as Rep. Bird said, over the last couple of elections, we've reduced our state income tax rate from 4.55 to 4.5 and then to 4.4. And what that's done is, we have a low statewide tax. And what that's done is that's put more burden on our local governments to fill in the gaps that we've seen in the state. And so because local governments also from TABOR are prohibited from levying any kind of income tax, they rely on sales taxes and property taxes to fund their responsibilities to their communities. And that makes their local taxes much more regressive. And so the only bulwark against these regressive taxes is really a progressive income tax, but we are prohibited from doing that. So as you can see with this graph on the right, total state and local taxes in Colorado, we have a very regressive tax system here in Colorado. The top 1% pay about 6.5% of their taxes, of their income and taxes, whereas those making less than $22,000 pay 8.7%. And this has caused a lot of problems. And as we've tried to make headway in state government, what's happened is local government has had to increase their sales taxes or their property taxes. And we're seeing the effects of some of that on the local level. And the other thing I would say with on the income tax space specifically is that when we do cut income taxes, because we are forced to do it in a flat way, our income tax cuts are incredibly regressive. And so as you can see, every time we cut income tax, those making $50,000 and below see very small percentage of it, even if they are the largest share of taxpayers in this state. Whereas the top 1%, those making about $500,000 and above, see a significant benefit from tax cuts, even as they are the smallest percentage of taxpayers in this state. And so we've kind of created this system where when we want to cut taxes to give tax relief, and there were a lot of people who desperately needed it with the economic conditions that we've been in over the last several years. The only way to do that is to cut income taxes, which end up giving a significant benefit to those who, frankly, don't really need that kind of tax relief. The next thing I want to get into is kind of the budgeting. And I know Rep. Bird has probably seen this chart more times over the last several months than she ever thought she would. But this is kind of a look at our Colorado's budgeting over time. And you can see that these dark blue are the dollars that we have above what is known as the referendum seat cap, or what we are not allowed to spend in Colorado and have to be given back to taxpayers in one way or another. And so as you can see, in 2021-22, it was about $3.73 billion. And we're going to see billions of dollars in these quote unquote TABOR rebates going forward over the next several years. And the problem with that is that we have a lot of needs in this state that we are not funding adequately. And I know a lot of folks care deeply about how we fund K-12 education and the fact that we don't pay our teachers enough and our schools are not well equipped to handle a lot of the challenges that are coming our way in the 21st century. And yet we have $2.75 billion and in this new budget, approximately $2 billion that we're just not allowed to spend on anything. And we have to give them back in some way, shape, or form to Colorado taxpayers. And one of the issues with that is that it wouldn't be such a bad deal to give it back to Colorado taxpayers, but the way that we've done it in the past, prior to this last summer when everybody got their Colorado cash back benefits, is that we had done it in a highly regressive way. We had done it through income tax cuts, and we had done it through an outdated, what's known as the 6-tier sales tax refund mechanism, which was something done in the late 90s to kind of try and model spending habits of every income quartile. And so those at the higher end of the income spectrum would get more back. Those at the lower end of the income spectrum would get less back. And thankfully, last year, the legislature and the governor came together and passed a bill to make sure that everybody got the same amount. And we would like to see that done even more and target the people that really need this help even more. But the bottom line is that we should be able to choose what we do with this $2 billion. But TABOR says we have to give it back and not spend it on schools, not spend it on healthcare, not spend it on transportation, or other things that our legislators and policymakers could choose to spend it on. As Rep. Byrd was saying, we can't do that under the current TABOR system. And what that's led to is this structural deficit where we have operating growth at 6.75%. And this is a chart from the governor's office looking at what's going to happen as the TABOR limit continues to restrain any kind of growth that we may have. And as our needs as a population keep going up, we're going to see our ability to keep spending at the level that we have be reduced in a lot of areas. And so we're coming up on a time where we have very little money under the TABOR cap, under the referendum C limit, to be able to spend on new or even existing programs. And that's going to lead to what's known as kind of these cuts where we're still spending more, but our money is going less far with those dollars because the needs of our people as our population goes up and up. And I want to spend 1 second. Rep. Byrd mentioned, the formula that we use to determine, which is population growth plus inflation. And one of the issues is Rep. Byrd mentioned that the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is not a good proxy for how government spends its money. And that's definitely true. And another problem with that is it's a lagging indicator because we use the previous year's inflation percentage to inform the next year's budget. And so we're not taking into account current inflation, we're taking into account past inflation. But population is also not a good proxy for the needs of the people because, as many of you probably can intuit, there are segments of the population that need government help more than others. So our younger Coloradans, those in early childhood education, pre-K, who have needs, are assumed to need the same amount of government spending as those in their mid to late 30s, healthy, working professionally, and all of that. Our older Coloradans who may need help with Medicare, Medicaid, disability, other kinds of government programs are thought of to be exactly the same as those middle-aged Coloradans who go skiing every weekend and maybe don't need any kind of governmental help. And that's just not a good way to plan for the needs of the people and how we should appropriate the money for government. And so what it does is it's really restraining our ability to invest in the future because we can only think of what's right in front of our face. And that's really become one of the major issues is we can't invest in good times to take over, as Rep. Bird said, we can't even have a rainy day fund that's anything below the referendum CCAP. And so we can't invest when times are good and draw on that when times are bad. We have to just plan for what's right in front of our face, and that will lead to problems going forward as we see the structural deficit continuing to climb and really cut into the amount of services that the state of Colorado can provide to the people of this state. So I just wanted to kind of leave that there. The Bell Policy Center has a lot of great resources for you all that we would love for you to check out. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Rep. McLachlan and maybe have some opportunity to answer some questions.
Okay, thank you both so much. This is great. You know, I hear this stuff all the time and I learn something every single time. So thank you. It's always, I need to hear this a lot. So I guess our first question is there a simple way to explain TABOR's impact on schools? That's not a yes or no. Explain the impact on school.
I would love to start there because that's how I got involved in state government, was precisely this issue. So the state, we're in an interesting position. So let's just go back to the early 1980s in the state of Colorado. The way we fund schools, and this largely it's true even today, we have a local share component of funding. That's your property taxes, specific ownership taxes. So local share component that funds your schools. And then there's also a state share. And back in the early 1980s, if you can remember back that far, roughly 2/3 of your per pupil funding came from your local governments, your local property taxes, your local share, and the other 1/3 came from the state. After we passed a series of constitutional amendments, one of them being the Gallagher Amendment, which is now repealed, but recently repealed, Gallagher, and then also the passage of the TABOR Amendment, over time, and we don't need to get into the weeds on this, but over time that caused that balance to shift, where now we're at a place where the state funds roughly 2/3 of the per pupil cost of every student, and your local share funds roughly 1/3 of the cost. Every year, then I'm going to add another amendment. So Amendment 23 was passed, I think in the early 2000s, I can't remember, somebody else will correct me. And that created a mandatory amount of spending for public education. Amendment 23 says in our state that every year we must fund public schools equal as much as we funded last year, and then you must increase it by your student population growth and the rate of inflation, mostly the rate of inflation. So there's a mandatory amount of funding. Well, every year also the Constitution mandates that the state have a balanced budget. So back in, do you remember the Great Recession? Who could forget it? Back in 2008, our revenues were blown away. 2008 through 2009, we wound up getting backfilled. We received lots of support from the federal government, but when federal dollars went away in 2010, public education funding from the state was dramatically cut because we couldn't afford to keep up with the mandates of Amendment 23 and everything else that our state is required to support. So if you think about big things like higher education, although I know I typed in the chat that TABOR has limited how much we can spend on higher ed, higher education still is a big expense in our budget. Medicaid, the state's share of supporting Medicaid cost reimbursement is huge. The cost of prisons, every other function of the state requires a share of our general fund. And when we basically had the legs cut out from under us in 2010, after the Great Recession, the state could not meet all of these obligations. So at that point, because we could not afford fully our 2/3 share, we found a way, and I'm using the word we very liberally because neither Rep. McLachlan nor I were in the legislature at this time, but the legislature found a way to refigure how the state would fund its share of public education. And we have been trying to dig out of that hole ever since. And if you remember some of my introductory comments where I talked about TABOR having that limiting impact on the ability of our state to grow its revenue from year to year. If you're in a hole and all of your expenses are continuing to increase and you're not allowed to increase your resources at the same rate that your costs are going up, it's very challenging to dig yourself back out of the hole, if that's even the right reference, to pick yourself back up out of the hole. We are very close though. So I do want to tell you, we've been working really hard to make sure that we prioritize public education in our state. That has been something that I know Rhett McLachlan has been a tremendous leader on, even before I was in the legislature, making sure that our state has prioritized funding. And because of her leadership, we are very, very close. We are within striking distance of meeting our full obligation.
And I would just add to that, and a really great response from Representative Byrd, but that BS fact, that budget stabilization factor is really the floor for funding K through 12 education. The Bell Policy Center and our partners at the Colorado Fiscal Institute recently did some research and found to get to 25th in the nation in per pupil funding, we need an extra $1.1 billion in order to get there, which is, again, significantly more than the $321 million that we're coming into on the budget stabilization factor. And so getting rid of that budget stabilization factor is important and a good step, but we need to do so much more just to get to a place where we can feel confident that Colorado is meeting the needs of the students and the educators here in our state to get there.
And I'll just add that students graduating from high school now, and I will include my daughter amongst that group, have never known what it's like to have a fully funded public school. And honestly, that's shameful. People coming into the system don't, unless you've lived in another state and seen the resources that are available to students and teachers in other states, we are now in a place where we don't even know what we're missing. But I will say that as I make these comments, I don't want anybody to lose faith in our system of public schools, because the level of achievement that our students are still producing, what they're attaining, I should say, it matches any other state, which is kind of remarkable. But that sort of makes me think, what could our talented kids do with more investment if we were able to provide them with all the tools and all of the enrichment opportunities that students are getting in other states, the things that they would have open to them? That would be amazing. But I have hats off. I'm not an educator. I'm a lawyer. I'm just somebody who really believes in public schools. They matter to me and they matter to my family for our children. So I care about them deeply that way. But what our state has been able to do in our local school districts with the resources that they have has truly been remarkable.
Agreed. Okay, the next question. What was the raise in TABOR dollars from the increase in the CPI this year? And how does that compare with increased state costs?
I just want to leap here, and I bet Josh is going to have a more technical answer, but you would think that we would have all kinds of revenue because inflation was not great this last year, but we are lagging. So this is just from a budget perspective that we are using last year's rate of inflation to inform us about how much money we're able to collect and retain this budget cycle. But we have this year's inflationary expenses to deal with, and the two are not in alignment. So we have a cap that doesn't allow the state to retain the full rate of inflation that we're actually experiencing right now, which has created a whole other interesting dynamic for our state budget this year.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the issues with the formula, as I mentioned, is inflation is lagging. So it's the inflation of prior to the big spike in inflation that's informing the current budget. Next year's budget will have the spike in inflation, and it just doesn't match with what with what people are actually experiencing on the ground and the cost of services. As we know, one of the big drivers of inflation has been energy costs around the country, partly due to COVID supply chains, partly to the geopolitical problems that we've seen overseas, mainly with Russia. But we're not able to account for that. And energy is a big part of how we have to deal with a lot of this stuff, because energy is used for construction, for all these kinds of important things that government does spend money on. But we can't take that energy inflation into account when we're doing the current budget, as Rep. Byrd knows as well as anybody. But that'll be next year. And so it's really not a helpful indicator on how government should spend its money. It really just drives down the amount of money we're able to spend for now. And so I would say that the mismatch is a real problem in our budgeting cycle, especially when we see these kind of outlier events like the inflation that has been occurring over the last year.
Thank you. Okay, this one is it's by one person. It's kind of long, so I guess just pay attention. You may have to take notes. So Colorado has a lot of special districts. Are those a reaction to TABOR? Are communities creating special districts as an avenue to tax measures more likely to pass than a tax increase proposed by a county or municipality? This person is aware of a special district that has a mill levy approved in the 1990s. While it was passed as a 1 mill levy, it now has a value of 0.3 mills. How does this happen?
So special districts are another way of funding special projects. So there are all kinds of different types of districts too. So special districts, metro districts, they have all been, I think, an adaptation to the TABOR Amendment. And something that's really interesting about this is that, well, I feel like many times these special districts have been helpful because in the case of using a metro district, for example, for helping to build out a new neighborhood, that can be helpful because I know that a long-held value for many people in our state is that growth pays for itself. So a lot of times a special district form can help growth concentrate the cost of that new development and growth on the people who are new, and you're not taxing the people who've been there and who've been paying their taxes all along and not trying to pass on the cost of growth to them. So that has been helpful. But the thing that is challenging is that with a lot of different special districts, metro districts, we wind up having overlapping layers, taxation districts, which winds up ultimately, I think in many cases, costing us much more than if we had maybe one or two taxing entities like your school district and your state and your county and sometimes your city. Like already that's a lot. But then you layer on all of these districts that have been adaptations to some of the hurdles. I don't want to cast it negatively because I know a lot of people really appreciate TABOR and I definitely respect that. But I think that we all should be clear-eyed that TABOR, while it might keep state income taxes low, sometimes when you push a bubble here, it pokes out someplace else, right? So there are, I would call this an unintended consequence. And in many respects, because of this, we might have higher tax burden than we would have hoped for.
And I would agree with all of that. And I would also say, this is where kind of the regressivity that we've put into our tax system really comes into play, because these metro districts are really just levying property taxes or sales taxes, mostly property taxes for the special districts, whether it's a fire district, a police district, a water district. All of these are important infrastructural needs for the people of Colorado. But when we have low statewide taxes and we increase our local taxes, we're putting more of the burden on the lower and middle income Coloradans and taking the burden off of the wealthier, the ones who can afford. And so we've really made it's been an unconscious choice, but it's been a choice nonetheless that we've made as a state, as TABOR has gone on, that we've realized we really need a lot of these government services, whether it's water, whether it's the fire department, whether it's the recreational needs of our kids to have a park down the street. But we need to pay for that in some way, shape, or form. And so we have these special districts that come in and say, we can provide these services for you. And people say, great. And from our polling, we've seen that people are much more likely to vote for any kind of tax increase if they know where it's going. So local tax increases pass much easier than anything state level or even county level. County tax increases pass much easier. And so we've kind of sloughed off a lot of the state's responsibilities to local governments, whether that's special districts, cities, or counties. And so that's been kind of the overwhelming result of that. And in terms of the second part of that question, I think, which is why the mills have gone down, I think that's probably whatever special district that is what's known as floated their mills. And so they had a revenue target that they wanted to hit in order to fund whatever need that they had, whether that's a school or a fire department or whatever. And as more people moved in and there was more income available, the needs of each individual taxpayer was probably less. And so they are able to hit their revenue targets with less from each taxpayer as opposed to what was originally set out in the 1990s. And I assume because of the growth of all parts of Colorado, that was probably the case of that. And so they're just trying to hit their revenue target, and the voters gave them the ability to make their mills meet their revenue as opposed to have a set mill that increased their revenue over time if they didn't need that.
Excellent, thank you. You guys know what you're talking about. I like this. So several attempts through court action and voter initiative have been made to end TABOR. Do you see another attempt that might have a chance to succeed?
So I'm happy to take that one as the non-elected official of the group and the advocate who has been working on this. I would say that in terms of all of TABOR, the likelihood of wiping that out in the near future is probably fairly low. If you look at any kind of polling or people around Colorado, TABOR as a big idea is generally accepted. People like voting on their tax, like having the ability to vote on their tax increases. I think it's been hard for a lot of folks in my economic progressive community to accept that, but I think that that's generally true. Where I think there is a lot of desire is around kind of reforming some of the individual pieces in TABOR. When you actually look at all of the individual pieces of TABOR, there's a lot in there that is not as popular with the people of Colorado. One thing that I would say that we've seen over and over again is that Coloradans think that the wealthiest residents of our state should be paying a little bit more. And people are fairly agnostic on what that takes, on what form that should take. But I think there will be some more action around the idea that the wealthiest among us should pitch in a little bit more, pay what they owe to the state of Colorado, and that we should be able to spend that money in a productive way, like education, healthcare, or transportation. The Bell Policy Center recently filed a couple of ballot initiatives to look at possibly a luxury housing tax, so that people with whose homes are more than $2 million and above should have to pay a little bit more. Non-residential property owners whose properties are valued at $3 million and above maybe should pay a little bit more. I know there are a lot of allies who are looking at maybe some kind of wealth or wealthy income tax at the top. These are constitutional changes, so they would not be easy, and they would certainly have opposition. But I do think there is a growing appetite to deal with our revenue needs at the state. I think people are very much in tune to the fact that we are just not investing in the people of Colorado and in our communities in the way that I think folks expect their government to do, whether that's in education, whether that's in transportation, or what have you. And so I think there's groups looking at a whole host of these things. I know there are folks looking at maybe using some of the money above the TABOR's cap to fund some education initiatives. So I think you'll see some reforms around the edges of TABOR that will make meaningful differences for the people of Colorado in a positive direction. I don't know exactly what form all of that will take, but I do know that there are a lot of smart people working to look at how we can really think about changing TABOR in a more productive way knowing that there are still a lot of people who really support a lot of parts of TABOR while not necessarily supporting the whole kit and caboodle, if you will. So I think you'll see some movement around that over the next several years, but I don't know about a full TABOR repeal. That seems to be a little bit further off into the future for a lot of folks.
Representative Byrd, did you have anything to add to that? All right. So here's another education question. I'm not sure if if you feel like you covered it or not, but we'll ask it. How does TABOR limit K-12 schools' increasing demands to provide personalized instruction for each student, like IEPs, ILPs, MTSS, parental demands, etc., within an educational system that is barely able to fund traditional schools' batch-making models?
And recognizes that we're not doing well. That's part of that hole that we've been trying to dig out of. And what's really unfortunate is our schools are subject to federal laws that require certain services be provided to students with disabilities and that need extra supports. In addition, there are many state requirements as well, and they are not always funded. So where that winds up leaving many of our school districts is with significant unfunded mandates and big challenges. So it's definitely something that I know, again, and I will say, call out Representative McLachlan. Her leadership has really done so much over the years. We have increased funding for special ed, specifically dramatically, and I know she's involved in continued efforts. And I know this year we'll be making, because of her work, even additional significant investment in special education services.
Josh, did you have anything to add
Nope.
to that?
I mean, it all goes back to the fact that we just can't spend what we have available to us. And if we could, there's a lot of investments that we could make, and I think this would be probably one of the big ones that we would be looking at. But for the fact that we can't, we have to leave some things on the table and make really tough choices. If you listen to any joint budget committee hearing, it's all about making these extremely tough choices where you're pitting one important program against another. Do you give this extra $10 million to special education? Or do you give this extra $10 million to this important water conservation project? How are you supposed to make those decisions without hurting somebody? And that's kind of where we've been okay with leaving our budget. And so these all come down to zero-sum choices where you're pitting important programs against each other. And it's an unfortunate consequence that we've seen.
Yeah, I hear all the time what were you saying, Rep. Byrd?
This is my first year on the Joint Budget Committee, and what Josh just said is exactly right. And the other challenge that we have is when we're not able, we don't really know what we're going to have next year. We depend upon a forecast of what we think is going to come in, but there really isn't a way to really know what we have, and we don't really have control over what is going to come in, and have some limitations on how well we're able to plan for that. And what that means is it's very difficult to increase funding for programs that require ongoing investment. So what you'll see many times in the state is all kinds of pilot projects or grant programs. And the reason that you see things like that is because we know that, a pilot project just requires one-time money. So once the money's gone, the pilot's over, and maybe you learn something from it. Maybe it can inform a current practice that we know we can afford, but it's very difficult to do anything new or really to increase and grow revenue with ongoing dollars.
Yeah, we heard that a lot when we were campaigning. I think both of us did, is, what can we do for schools? How can we do this? And it's not an easy thing. People say, well, you have the money, why aren't you spending it on us? And our pie is limited. So there we have it. I did get a text question, and then I'll get to yours, Anonymous, in just a second. What percentage of state tax revenues are already earmarked for specific purposes?
A large share of Colorado's budget comes in the form of federal dollars, and those federal dollars are mandated to be spent in a specific way. where we don't have control over it. And that is a very large share of our budget. The last budget, or the budget that we're working on now, I think is about 16, this is going to sound huge, but think about how big our state is. It's about $16-17 billion. And that's just part of our budget to fund all of the things that we care about, right? Education, K-12, Medicaid, Department of Corrections, which is very expensive, our courts, Department of Public Safety, all the things, anything you count on the state to do depends upon that money and competes for those resources. So that's a much smaller share of the pie that we actually have discretion over.
So I think this is a really interesting question, and I really appreciate whoever brought this up, because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about how the budget works and how our tax dollars work and where they're spent and stuff. Rep. Byrd mentioned the $16 to $17 billion general fund, which is where lawmakers have the most discretion, if not all discretion over. About 61% of that is income tax based. So that's where most of the income tax dollars, that's where most of it goes. But we've been slowly reducing the amount of money of our tax dollars available for lawmakers' discretion. And while the Ballot Policy Center has been supportive of a lot of different ballot measures that have diverted income tax revenue to various things, what we've done is we've really tied the hands of our legislators in a lot of consequential ways. So, for example, Amendment 23, the Education Amendment came up. That mandates that 1/3 of 1% of 1/10%, so 0.033% of all income tax revenue goes into what's known as the state education fund and can only be spent on K-12 public education. Last year, we passed a proposition that put $300 million a year towards affordable housing programs. Again, these are great, important programs that we need to be putting more money into without question. But what we've done is we've taken the ability to make decisions off the plate of our lawmakers, the people who we elect to represent us, and already diverted it, and so that they have less money to deal with. And so we continue to do this. And again, this is because of TABOR, because of what TABOR's done, where people see that we're not spending enough money in these particular narrow programs, and they say, well, we need more money in those programs. Let's just make sure that that this specific amount of money is going there. Well, that's $300 million that can't be used for something else that maybe our lawmakers think it should be used for. And so we've continuously kind of siphoned off these small slices of our shrinking revenue pie into these little programs and really made it more difficult for us to make decisions on where we should put more funding into. And so I think that's one of the issues that we continually see is people try and go around the mandates of TABOR because they think things are important, which they are. We all want more affordable housing and housing in general in this state. Is mandating that $300 million do that the right decision? Maybe, maybe not, but that's $300 less million that we have. And when it comes to a point where maybe our economy takes a downturn and we don't have a buffer of TABOR, of money above the TABOR cap, then that's eating into the already spending that we've already decided that we want to spend. And so it creates these kind of hazards that we've decided to kind of we've tried to paper over and over again, but it really just creates more mandates and less choices for our lawmakers.
Can I add something to that? That is 100% correct. And I will just say, there is nothing that comes for free. So with respect, and I'll just go to Proposition 123, the affordable housing measure that we were just talking about, because that just happened recently. That didn't come with any new money. It didn't pay for anything. So what was really interesting is people who want so badly increased investment in public education were also out there campaigning vociferously for 123 without any new money to pay for it. Not realizing that literally this is a zero-sum game. You're all drawing from the same bucket of money. So I just offer to you as voters, be thoughtful about that when you get your ballot for citizen initiatives that want to grow new programs for our state and create new responsibilities for your general fund. Just think about that, because you, unless you have got new money to pay for this, you will be creating a new liability that will compete with things that you already want us to invest in. And it is a true problem. It's a big deal. And in fact, with Proposition 123, we are already grappling with how that will be handled. That could be devastating to our state budget, because the commitment that is required by that proposition in a non-TABOR refund year, that commitment could be devastating to key priorities of our state.
You said that to me your very first year in office, to me, that be careful what you spend. And so it was good advice from many years ago. So can an underfunded para be considered part of the state's annual budget responsibility under TABOR?
I've spent a lot of time on para. I'd love to talk about para. So yes. So now I used to know these numbers right off the top of my head, but we are about, I think, $30 billion underfunded with our para pension. That's about, give or take, $1 billion, which is a terrible thing to say, but that is about right. And back in 2018, and this is before I was elected, I think Representative McLachlan, you were in the legislature, there was a grand compromise and a big piece of legislation that was passed that would put Colorado on a path to fully funding its para liability. So what this bill did was create a shared sense of responsibility. We put our state on essentially a 30-year mortgage, where the state has an annual $225 million obligation to put in money into the para trust fund. In addition, retirees have limits on their COLAs. If investment returns are not good and the economy isn't good, then limits on your COLA, if a COLA at all. Again, if investment returns are not good and the market isn't good, current worker employee contributions have to go up, and also different state agencies that act as the employers, their share of the employer contribution also goes up. So it was this whole multifaceted mechanism to just kind of create automatic adjustments. So over the course of the next 30 years, so by 2048, our state should have its para pension liability paid off. So directly to your question, as part of the mandates, and we imposed this mandate on ourselves, this was some important fiscal discipline. The state does have an annual $225 million obligation to make a payment to para, and that's through the year 2048.
I would just add that in during the year that when the legislature shut down for COVID, when the economy shut down for COVID, the forecast showed a significant budget deficit that we were having to deal with as a state. There was around $3.3 billion in cuts that had to be made in order to balance what they expected to be a very tough budget. Now, we rebounded very quickly, and it wasn't quite as bad as what our economic forecasters had imagined. And so we didn't end up having to cut as much. But one of the things that we did cut was that para liability, that $225 million. And I think the reason why I bring that up is to show that when economic downturns hit, this is where things get really tricky. It's not easy to budget in Colorado in good times, as Rupert can attest to. But it's really hard to budget when our revenues are significantly lower than what we would expect them to be. And so this is where our inability to invest money when times are good really comes back to bite us, because when times are bad, we end up having to cut so much more than we otherwise would have. Now, recently, the Joint Budget Committee and the governor have really focused on making sure that our reserves are able to withstand an economic downturn, and that's going to be really helpful if and when something does happen. But these are the kinds of things that are on the chopping block, whether it's para, higher education always gets a significant haircut when our budget dips. And so this is just another impact of our inability to save money when times are good and then invest in communities when times are good. And para is just, it tends to be at the top of the list of these cuts that happen when we have to make significant budget cuts.
Probably the biggest piece of legislation I ran last year was to make that payment and pay para back. So we did come back and do that, but Josh is exactly right. It's a big number. And when every year you must pass, we have a constitutional responsibility to pass a balanced budget. That's a big number. And when people need to be able to go to the doctors, if you're sick and relying on Medicaid, or seniors relying upon our social safety net, you need school funding, and we have a constitutional responsibility to fund our schools as well. All of these other non-constitutional responsibilities and non-health and safety responsibilities are the first on the chopping block. And the other point though, so if you are a para recipient, you should know that we paid that back and we are on track. And in fact, that payment saved you from a negative auto adjust. So thank goodness, because that would have been terrible. The other thing though, we have a 15% reserve that we've been able to build over time. That was a priority for us as we built your budget this year. And also in addition to that, another 3% required reserve for TABOR. So we are attempting to be well positioned in the event there is another economic downturn.
I said yay, but I was muted, so yay. One more question. I'm sorry, the last one we won't get to tonight, but what part of the federal designated funds go toward dementia healthcare in Colorado? And I would say all healthcare, because it's all important to someone in Colorado, and it's there's a big need. And they're just talking about federal dollars here. No idea? Josh, do you know?
I don't know the number. I do know that the federal government does contribute a significant portion of our healthcare budget, you know, for a lot of reasons. But, you know, we expanded Medicaid here in Colorado after the Affordable Care Act. And as part of that, the federal government puts in a significant amount of money for us to be able to do that. And that includes all of this kind of healthcare here. And I think that's an important aspect, is that we need to take advantage of the federal government giving us. As Rep. Bird said, you know, when we have economic downturns, this was the case during COVID, this was the case during the Great Recession, the federal government is the investor of last resort. They're the ones who come in and try and help us fill the holes. And when they back out, that's when we need to come in and try and make that up. And that's what's happened to our education system, is that we did not have the ability to do that. And so healthcare is a good example of the federal government keeping their bargain to us and continually investing in Colorado so that we can match their dollars in some way and continue making sure that we have the resources necessary to care for the people here. But I don't know the exact number, but it's a significant portion of our healthcare budget that comes from the federal government.
Thank you. If you guys would like to give some closing statements here, and we'll wrap it up and let everybody go home. We in the House have had many, many days of no sleep, so we're all a little worn out. So I'll let which one of you can do nose goes or whatever you do to choose who goes first.
I'll just say thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure. I love to talk about our state. You know, what we spend money on really is a reflection of our values. It's one of the biggest responsibilities that we have, that we are good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. We know you work hard to earn your money, just as any one of us does. And you want to make sure that your elected officials are investing those dollars wisely and investing them in things that matter to the people of our state. We do have challenges, but you know, sometimes some of those challenges enforce some discipline, and that's okay too. It's good to prioritize and be thoughtful about how we spend. But I think since the topic of today's discussion was TABOR, I think the biggest takeaway, aside from any of the pieces of interesting information that you gathered here today, is really for you to recognize your responsibility in a democracy. In Colorado, because you have the power of the purse, it's not your legislators, it's you. And as voters, you have a heightened responsibility to really understand spending questions when you see them on your ballot. And that's not always easy. You are not sitting in the legislature for 120 days. You don't have the same exposure to tax experts and policy experts the way that we do. So I feel like most citizens have to put in much extra effort to really make responsible voting decisions when you see these measures on your ballot. And most people have no idea that Proposition 123 would create really pretty significant burden on our state budget in years when our budget is lean. That's going to be a really big problem. And the average voter wouldn't know that because they don't know the nuances of how we pay for things in our state. So my admonition to everyone is please make sure when you see tax and spending questions on your ballot, please be very thoughtful. Do your research, ask as many questions as you can, because we need you to be informed. The financial health of our state depends upon it.
I would just say thank you to Rep. McLachlan for having me and to be in the presence of two amazing public servants. I really appreciate the work that you two do for the state of Colorado and for your individual districts, and all of the members of our state legislature who are really working overtime. And I know, well, you guys will likely be in this weekend as well, unfortunately. But I think to what Rep. Bird says, one of the issues that I think we see all the time is that it is about the whom question. Whom do these things benefit? Who pays? Who saves? All of these things are really important and are not really given with a top line summary. And it's something you have to dig for. And unfortunately, that's made things more difficult. The Ballot Policy Center has done a lot of work in some ballot transparency measures to make sure that you have a better understanding of where you line up for a lot of these tax and spend questions. But these are really complicated issues. And with voters as the ultimate policymakers on fiscal issues in our state, it's really, as Rep. Bird said, it's incumbent on you to learn and be informed. It would be easier if our elected representatives could do what they were sent to Denver to do, but that's not the way our system is set up. But these are really thorny issues with no necessarily correct answers. But I think, being on a town hall like this is a good way to get informed. Reading blue books, following what's happening at the legislature and what your representatives are doing has never been more important than it is right now, and kind of learning about how this system actually works and who's benefiting from these decisions that are being made both at the ballot and within the legislature. From the Ballot Policy Center's perspective, we feel strongly that that a lot of things need to be more targeted and made better for low, middle income Coloradans, and not just serve the interests of those who have lobbyists or those at the top. And so we're going to be continue working on that and fighting for that. But it's always great to have representatives who understand those issues, leading the way when it comes to our budget, our education system, or whatever it may be. So I just thank you for the opportunity to be here, and for all of you for taking time out of your Wednesday evening to listen to TABOR, and just keep learning.
Well, thank you both very much for your expertise. The recording of this will be put on my Facebook within about 24 hours, whenever we can get around to actually doing it, but it'll be there. And then you can hear it again. You can watch the slides. You can you can replay if you need to say, what was that was said? So it'll be helpful, I think. So, but thank you very much. You guys are the best, and I really appreciate your brains. So thank you. Okay. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I appreciate it. Thanks. Bye.